You know, when you're rereading your own manuscript and you hit a section of dialogue and you think, wait, did character A just say something that sounds exactly like character B? Or even worse, do both of them sound exactly like me? Or you're in a scene that should feel very emotionally charged, but your protagonist just feels flat. Like you're just watching, the scene in the way you would if a camera just recorded the events, but you're not really feeling like you're living inside of them. And that's especially frustrating if this is a character that you have already worked really hard on. They have flaws, they have a backstory, they have story motivations. And still something is missing. They just don't feel alive on the page. Well, here's what I want you to hear. There's a very good chance that the problem that is causing this is not the problem you think it is. In this video, I'm going to walk you through some mistakes that quietly, invisibly flatten your characters, and that most authors don't even realize they're making. Because most people don't talk about these. They aren't necessarily in craft books, but they're responsible for a lot of that I don't know why this isn't working feeling that you often get when you're trying to get your story written. So if you're in the trenches trying to write a character who isn't landing the way you need them to, then this video is for you. Let's get into it. Before I get into the mistakes though, I want you to understand that it is not just you experiencing this. A lot of writers do. You are not like uniquely bad at this, okay? That's not a thing. This is actually more of a gap in how character craft gets taught, and it affects writers at every level. So here's what I hear constantly. My characters all sound the same. My dialogue feels interchangeable. I could switch the dialogue from character A to character B and nobody would blink an eye. My protagonist feels reactive, like things happen to her and she responds, but she doesn't feel like an actual real person who's driving her own story. I can describe what my character looks like and what she's trying to accomplish, but when I try to get into her head and write from her perspective, it feels a little hollow. It feels like me pretending to be someone else badly. And what is probably the most painful version of this, I am so far into my manuscript and I feel like I've lost track of who my character is. I keep describing her differently, like giving her three different eye colors in three different chapters. I can't remember if she was the one who was afraid of dogs or if that was my other character. And I have no idea what she would actually say in this scene because I don't have a clear enough sense of her own voice. Do any of those land for you? If yes, give me a facepalm in the comments. Now, I know that if you're struggling with any of these things, you have done stuff to try and solve it. I know that you are really trying hard to get your story finished. So like maybe you've tried reading your dialogue out loud to see if it sounds natural. And that's actually good advice. That helps you catch a few things, but it's not going to solve the problem of all of your characters sounding alike. Because the problem isn't really about whether your dialogue sounds natural in isolation. It's about whether that dialogue sounds like that particular character. And those are two different problems, right? Maybe you've tried writing character journals or getting into character in various ways, just free writing from their perspective before you sit down to write a scene. And again, it's not that that's bad, that can be helpful, but if you don't have a very clear intentional framework for who this character is, then every time you sit down to do that, you're going to be improvising. And the result is a character who feels slightly different from scene to scene. And at its worst, maybe their choices and their actions don't make sense. And the reader can't get on board with why that character just did that. Maybe at some point you wrote down a description for your character, but then you lost it, or it's just buried so deep in a file on your computer somewhere that you can't be bothered going to find it. So when you're rereading or you're editing, you realize you gave your character three different eye colors in three different chapters. Obviously, that's a problem. It's a discontinuity. It's especially bad if you make a big mistake like that and one of your beta readers catches it, and then you just kind of want to curl up and die a little bit. I know that's not just me. Here is what all of these attempts to fix the problem have in common. They're all reactive. They're fixes that you try to apply after the fact or in the moment, rather than taking care of things intentionally before you start writing. And that's the shift we need to make today, okay? So here are the three mistakes you're making. And I want you to really sit with these and think about them deeply because chances are one of them is the culprit behind what you're experiencing right now, behind the frustration that you're trying to work through. Mistake number one is not intentionally crafting your character's voice. And I want to be really specific in what I mean by character voice here, because that's another one of those terms in our industry that gets thrown around a lot, and people have a really hard time actually defining what it means. And not so much, objectively what it means, but functionally and mechanically. How do you craft a character voice? What is it? What do you need to do? So I want to define it really clearly here. Your character voice is the consistent, specific way that they use language. It is specific to them and it conveys the uniqueness of who they are. Okay, so it is their vocabulary and the type of words they use. Think somebody who is very intellectual and very well educated versus somebody who is very ignorant. The types of vocabulary they use are going to be different. It is the figures of speech they use. It is the kinds of things that they say over and over again. It can be colloquialisms. It can be things like metaphors that come from their upbringing or from their culture or from the industry they work in. Okay, so it's not just their dialogue. It is the things they say over and over and over again and the way in which they say them that makes it unique to them and actually is part of their character. And here's the thing, it is very rare that character voice will simply emerge organically if you start writing. Sometimes it does for very, very seasoned writers who've been doing this a long time. But for most writers, especially those just starting out, your character voice is going to stay generic, meaning it defaults to the author's natural voice. It's just going to be your voice coming through unless it has been intentionally built. Okay, I want you to think about the difference in Pride and Prejudice between Elizabeth Bennet and her sister Jane. Now, they have been brought up in the same culture, in the same village, even in the same family. So it would be very, very easy for them to sound very, very alike. But they don't. On the page, they come across completely differently. Elizabeth is quick, ironic, quick to judge, quick to laugh, whereas Jane is warm and generous and slow to believe anything bad about anyone. You absolutely could not swap the internal monologue of these characters and have it work. Readers would immediately know, wait a minute, this is not Lizzie, this is Jane, right? And Jane Austen did not stumble into that distinction. She did not just start writing and organically let the voices figure themselves out, right? She built it deliberately based on who the characters are. So the mistake isn't that you don't know how to write distinct voices, it's that you haven't actually sat down and intentionally crafted this character's voice before you started writing. You've been improvising their voice scene by scene, and improvised voices tend to drift, okay? They blur, they default. And the fix here is not complicated or difficult, but it does require a little bit of attention and intention. You need to decide consciously what makes this character's voice theirs. What words do they use and phrases? What words would they never use? Where do they over-explain? Where does their insecurity come through in the way that they're talking? How do they express emotion when they are talking and interacting with others? Once you've done this work and you know exactly what their voice sounds like, staying consistent with it on the page becomes so much easier because you have something concrete to check yourself against. Mistake number 2, you haven't intentionally crafted your character's personality. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. No, I have thought about my character's personality. I know that my protagonist is introverted and stubborn and loyal to a fault. And okay, great. That's a fantastic starting point. But here's the problem. It's a list of adjectives. It's not necessarily a personality. All of those things are more like a description of personality. And those things are very different when it comes to being in the middle of a scene and trying to figure out what your character is going to do. Because here's where the character's personality actually matters. This is where it gets really practical. Personality matters most in moments of friction, or in fiction, what we would call conflict, right? In moments of choice, in moments of pressure. That's when you need to know in your bones how this specific person processes stress, how they handle conflict, whether they would go quiet or loud when they're scared. I like to call these emotional reactions, planning exactly how a character shows emotion, what they would do in the moment, that sort of thing. That is personality in action, and that is what makes your character feel three-dimensional versus flat. Now, you can use any personality system here. I personally like the Enneagram. And yes, I know I've mentioned in previous videos that personality typing systems have limits, and they absolutely do. But they can also be useful if you go beyond just what the number and the basic description of the personality is, and look at stress behaviors and integration behaviors so that you know how they're likely to react to certain things in the moment. And this gives you something really concrete to work with. You get a picture of how a character behaves when everything is falling apart versus on their best day. And that is very, very useful for plotting your character's arc, okay? But make sure that when you're doing this, you don't stay at the surface level, okay? So a mistake version of this would be like someone saying, okay, my character is an Enneagram 4, she's dramatic and artistic, and they stop there. That is just like the very surface level writing advice in the craft books that I'm always harping on, because it doesn't actually tell you how to take what is being said there and translate it into what goes onto the page in your story, right? So don't make the mistake of just doing that. That's not really planning. All that is doing is reading about a personality type, but it doesn't help you put it into your story, okay? So you need to ask the harder questions here. Given this person's specific personality, what is their default pattern when they feel threatened, okay? What about when they're in love? How do they show that based on their personality? What about when they're embarrassed? When they feel betrayed? What does this type of personality do under a specific type of pressure? So you want to take the personality you've chosen for them, find 2 or 3 traits that that personality type has, and then look at your story and say, how would they react when this happens in my story, when this happens in my story, when this happens in my story? That is how you bring their personality across on the page. Because your plot is full of pressure. And every time your character hits a pressure point, your readers are going to be watching to see if the character responds like herself. If she does, they feel it. They feel connected to her. They believe what's happening. If she doesn't, if she responds in a way that is convenient for your plot, but not true to her personality, a reader is going to feel that too. They may not be able to articulate that necessarily, but they're going to pull back emotionally. The connection they have with the character suddenly doesn't feel authentic anymore. And that's when you start to get notes like, I didn't really connect with this scene. So the fix here is just intentionality. It's just taking a few extra minutes to think about it deeply. Get to know your character's personality, not as a list of traits, but rather as a living dynamic system for how they respond to certain types of pressure, to certain types of situations. And that is going to make all the difference in how well your reader feels like they know your character. All right, mistake number 3, you are not keeping a character Bible. And this is the most practical of the 3, the thing that you can actually do something with, sit down today and just start doing this. It's the most immediately fixable. So if you are going to do one thing after you finish watching this video, do this. There are a lot of people out there that talk about story Bibles, and they're just a way to keep track of everything you have written so far, especially if you're doing a series. But I advocate keeping a character Bible. The character Bible is a living document, okay? You can keep this in a notebook, you can keep it in a file on your computer, on your phone, whatever works best for you. But this is where you keep track of everything about your character. So physical description, personality traits, emotional reactions, voice notes, the wound, the limiting belief, maybe even a quick description of the transformation. You can keep their insecurities here, their relationships, their speech patterns, their contradictions, anything that you have established that needs to stay the same, you need to keep in this character Bible. It's going to be your single source of truth for this character. And I cannot tell you how many authors I talk to who are deep in a manuscript with no central document. And I'm not going to lie, unfortunately, I have been guilty of this as well. And it's not fun. Because what that means is that maybe you have notes, but they're scattered across 4 different places or platforms. Maybe some of them are digital. Maybe some of them are sticky notes that you can't find anymore. You have something that you remember and you think you put into your story, but you're not sure. And the result is like an amateur level of inconsistency. And that comes not because you're careless and not because you don't care about your story, obviously, but because the human brain is not a reliable storage system for hundreds of micro decisions made across months of writing, right? We are not built for that. There are so many moving pieces in your story that you have to keep track of. Stop trying to keep them all in your brain. The character Bible solves this. It may not be the most sexy solution. We would all love to say we just keep it all up here and drag it on out when we need it on the page, but that is not realistic. That is why you end up giving your character 3 different eye colors across 3 different chapters. Having a character Bible is the infrastructure that allows you to write with confidence, to make a decision about your character in chapter 2 and still be honoring that decision in chapter 22, without having to reread your entire manuscript every time that you are unsure or can't remember what you said before. Okay, at minimum, this is what you should include in your character Bible. Physical appearance in specific detail, voice and speech patterns, a personality summary, including how they behave under stress, the wound and the limiting belief, the planned transformation, key relationships and how those relationships function. And as you write, anything you establish on the page that you need to stay consistent with. So this is hair color, the scar on the left hand, whether she takes her coffee black, the name of her child best friend she mentioned once in chapter 3. And anything, again, that is relevant to your story and that needs to stay the same, that you might need to call back to at some point, needs to go into your character Bible. And here's the thing I really want you to hear. It doesn't matter how far into your manuscript you currently are. Even if you don't have a character Bible, you can start one today. Go back through what you've written, pull out everything you've established, and put it in one place. Now, this may be a little bit of a pain if you're in the middle of a project because it is going to take a few hours to get this done, but it will save you weeks of revision and frustration down the road. And once you learn how to do this and do it from the beginning when you're planning your next story, oh, it's going to make things so much easier. You can thank me later when you don't remember what that detail is, but you go back to your character Bible and it's right there. You've got it. You don't have to worry about being inconsistent or, screwing it up and saying one thing here and another thing there. It's just all there for you to have. Okay, so let's take a step back for a minute and look at what these 3 mistakes have in common, because there is a common thread running through all of them. Voice, personality, and character Bible. All of them are about intentionality. All 3 of them are things that authors assume will just happen if they spend enough time with their characters. But that's not true. That's something the author assumes that is incorrect. Actually, all of these things require a deliberate, proactive decision to build and maintain. And when you don't have them, when they are absent, you get symptoms that look like a dozen different problems. You have flat dialogue, you have inconsistent behavior, you have scenes that don't land, you have readers saying that they didn't feel it. But the root of the problem is always the same. The character was never fully or deliberately constructed. They were discovered in writing and never solidified into something stable. That's not a talent problem. It's not a creativity problem, and it is certainly not a discipline problem. It is a process problem. And process problems are fixable. Always. When you have an intentionally crafted voice for a character, their presence on the page becomes unmistakable. Let me give you one more example where we see this a lot of times from authors. Those books where they feel like they have to write the character's name at the top of the chapter, like as the title. I'm not throwing shade to anyone who does that, but I can't help but feel that the reason for that is that they are afraid that you're not going to know who's speaking when they start the chapter. If you have an intentional character voice, you will not have that problem. The reader will immediately know who's speaking by the way that they sound. And the same holds true for the other things we've talked about. When you have an intentionally crafted personality, their choices under pressure feel inevitable and human. When you have intentionally crafted and kept track of what they look like, their description is always the same. Let's try Harry Potter out one more time. Every single time that Rowling describes him, she describes him the same way. And I don't just mean that he always looks the same. I mean, she uses the same words and phrases to describe him every single time. We are so afraid of repeating ourselves, but that intentional repetition helps readers to know who the character is. She always described him with the round spectacles, the green eyes, and the messy hair and the scar. And she used the same words and phrases every time. So we know exactly what Harry looks like, always. And of course, if you keep that information in your character Bible, you can write 400 pages or more with confidence that you're never going to lose track of who the character is. That's not a small thing. That's huge. That makes all the difference in the confidence with which you finish your story. Honestly, it's the difference between finishing a draft that feels like it's kind of falling apart and finishing a draft that you know is working. In the next video, I'm going to show you something that makes all of this very real. I'm going to share one of my students' stories. She came to me with a story that had been knocking around in her head for several years, and she knew who her main character was, or at least she thought she did. But as we started to go through this framework, she realized how much she did not have nailed down, and that was why her story was still swimming around in her head and had not been put on the page anymore. She went from, I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to write this story because I just can't seem to sit down and get to it, to a place where she went, wow, this is how I finish it. Now I'm going to be able to. So this video is right here. Please check it out and see what a difference these frameworks make to authors who actually implement them.